Now, my next guest has made a name for himself on the international poetry and spoken word scenes. Last year, Ghalib Lone came second in New York's Poetry Slam. His poem At Sea retold the story of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, whose image made global headlines after he drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. The poem has been picked up by the UN, and Ghalib is about to release a film to accompany the poem. Here's a clip from it.
I need to go back. I need to go back to a place where my mind was clear. But I can't seem to see through the fog. It's so unclear. Mind you, if I keep going back to an idea of yesteryear, will I eventually end up back at one? Or was one never quite that clear? We're plugged into a world built upon fear of missing out on things to eat and places to be. And if that place was a spot by the sea, would those same Syrian refugees not bite your hand off to no longer see the never-ending sea, tucking in back at home to a bit of hummus and a cup of tea?
That's a clip there from the poem, and Ghalib joins me on the line now. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Yasmin.
So tell me about how you came about writing this poem to start with.
Sure. So the poem itself was written last September. Khalid Hosseini, who's the author of The Kite Runner, he was in London, in the London South Bank, speaking about his new book, which is called A Prayer at Sea. So I just gone with one of my best friends and his sister, and we gone and sat in the audience to listen to him speak about this new book. Now, as I came to know, the book was about Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian child who'd been washed up ashore, and it was telling the story through what life would have been like for him prior to getting on that boat on which he tragically then drowns. So one thing struck and resonated with me quite strongly when he was there. Everyone, I think, was quite taken aback. It was a very emotional evening. And he just said that, as someone who's now an ambassador for the UN Refugee Agency himself, he said that we were all once refugees. And that line, I remember just feeling at the time that it was like the penny dropped, and how desensitized we've become as a world to other people's struggles, and hearing more and more about people just drowning at sea as if it's just another ticker headline. So I felt at that time quite emotional and felt the need to go and write something about that. So the next day I wrote a poem which was called At Sea.
And is it typical of the kind of topics or the style of poetry that you normally do?
I've been writing for about 16 years now, so my poetry has definitely gone through different changes and variations, and I think growing up for me it was very much about discussing various themes and topics and trying to be playful and creative with the ideas of poetry. My grandmother passes away when I'm about 17 years old, and at that point I then make a point of trying to use my poetry to speak about every key chapter and verse that I go through in my life. So from that point, I'm then discussing things that really have an impact on me. So in terms of whether or not it's in keeping with my style, I've written about social conscious matters in the past, but most certainly not as perhaps as well known as a matter like this, for example.
And for those that don't know, the poetry scene or the spoken word scene is something that's incredibly vibrant. I don't know if you would agree, but I've been to a few nights and I think, gosh, I wonder how many people know about this and know how much, because, you know, often people will do poetry at school and find it a bit dry, or it's not for them, it doesn't ignite them, but they don't know about the sort of range of spoken word and spoken word artists that there are out there.
Absolutely. I mean, for myself, who graduated 10 years ago, at the time it was definitely seen as almost a bit like, oh, that's quite interesting, but a bit odd that you write poetry, as opposed to now fast forwarding and you have well-established evenings throughout London where you've got top poets, spoken word artists who are ultimately speaking their experiences or their truths, and it's something that clearly has definitely hit the popular culture away perhaps from where there were generations of music through the pop culture, etc., being something which the public would have digested, but perhaps for a desire for something a bit more deeper in terms of meaning and a sense of analysis and introspection, poetry was something that always had that. So it's interesting definitely to see it have re-emerged in that sense.
Do you think that the average person, because I remember studying poetry at school and it seemed to be far more about rules than any other kind of writing, given that this is what you now do and you're on the scene, do you think, when you sit down to write a poem, do you think about rules and think, well, this has to go there or that has to scan or there should be a rhyme here?
Yeah, it's interesting because poetry definitely comes in different forms and guises, and at school you're taught poems through Shakespeare, sonnets, especially in England, all the different types of narrative poetry that exist, or dramatic poetry, which is where spoken word comes in, because spoken word is very much about a live performance to try and almost invigorate the crowd to be able to connect with those words and the way the words almost punctuate a feeling. And I think in terms of how it's definitely taken by a public audience, now poetry, if you look at it from the hip-hop and rap culture in the West, I'd say, there was a massive sense of rhyme and rhythm from the 90s onwards, but, from a South Asian tradition where, for myself, originally being Kashmiri, there's something, my name is Ghalib, from the very famous poet Mirza Ghalib, and there's a long tradition within the South Asian culture of poetry, which is then turned into some degree of music. So you have Rahat Fateh Ali Khan, who is singing out Ghalib's poetry, to Ghulam Ali singing Abad al-Alim, and all these various more modern poets. So that, I think, was something which, in the South Asian context, has been there all the time. In the Western context, I think or popular music has always been seen as distinct to poetry to some degree, and perhaps now poetry is being more accepted as an independent form of art in and of itself.
It's fascinating because, as you say, there's more of a connection between the forms, whereas in the West perhaps not so, which is why it's always been seen as a little bit separate. And I've certainly noticed, going to these sort of poetry nights and poetry slams and things, that there seems to be a good deal of South Asian artists out there.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's interesting, especially because London is a melting pot for so many different types of cultures. So you get to see so many different types of people speaking from their experiences, especially from those from the South Asian background. It's quite interesting when you hear those speaking about the idea of belonging and the idea of identity and trying to understand, for those who come from migrant cultures, what it means for them to be, for example, British, but coming from a South Asian background, and having to deal with the different types of cultural taboos that come with either of those backgrounds. So I definitely agree that I think there's been a massive boon, and the likes of Rupi Kaur in the United States has well over, I think, 1 million followers on Instagram. So, and she's a poet, and she's someone who just extends her thoughts through a poetic framework, and that clearly resonated with an increasing number of younger people throughout the world.
And so you're very much part of this scene. You're out there, you're performing. Your poem, as I mentioned, has been picked up by the UN, and there is a film to accompany the piece. What will happen to that?
Right, so I've basically produced the poem is called At Sea, and at the end of next month I have my director of photography, Mike Lubeck, who's in New York. Hi Mike, if you're listening, and he is currently in the final stages of editing and cutting the film. So by the time that's ready, that will be screened at an art gallery in London. My work thus far has been hosted by one of the main Middle Eastern art galleries, P21, which is based in King's Cross. So now we'll be just determining where it will go, but yes, it will be hosted by one organisation or another, which is then also now fully endorsed and supported by the UN Refugee Agency.
Well, it sounds like you're on an upward trajectory, so good luck to you. And may I just say that you're not alone. As I said, there are many South Asians into poetry, and we've been talking about decluttering this evening. And I remember at home in the house I grew up in, the one thing I've told my mum not to declutter is a yellow hardback book of my own poetry that I wrote when I was 11. I was featured in the local paper. I think the poetry from memory was fairly dreadful, but I'm proud of it nonetheless.
Well, Yasmin, I hope you'll share that. And also, if I could, I was reading on the weekend The Magic of Tidying, just coincidentally. So I think one thing with poets and writers is they have a lot of clutter, especially in the mental space where their thoughts are trying to be processed. And to any young person who's listening to this, if you have a desire to be able to write, especially from a South Asian culture, which I believe your audience is, I really hope that they will take it forward, because often it's neglected in our cultures where perhaps there's more emphasis upon the more popular arts of, be it going to social sciences or becoming an economist or what have you, which don't seek to deter and take people away from. But I just hope that, as generations move forward, that more emphasis is placed on the arts, on be it poetry for me, because that to me is a medium of expressing a far more nuanced understanding of people's own experiences and perspectives.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it is something that is going to change, or is changing, because I work a lot in theatre, and in the last few years I've noticed that there are more people from minority backgrounds going into theatre, not necessarily getting where they want to because there are barriers, but at least they're out there and they're trying. So I think attitudes are changing. But listen, thank you so much for talking to us. If people want to come and find you online, what's the best way?
Yes, so my Instagram page is Ghalib's Poetry, which is Ghalib with an S and poetry, and my YouTube page is Ghalib '(S) and space poetry, and you'll see lots of Mirza Ghalib faces. He's a big beard, with a white big beard and a big hat, which isn't me, just to confirm. So I hope that can be distinguished.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having us.
You take good care.